You ever watch a rich person buy something and think, wait, why didn't they just pay cash? Like they've got the money sitting right there, and instead they take out a loan. A guy buys a $2 million building and finances 80% of it. A woman with a 7-figure stock portfolio takes out a loan against it instead of selling a single share. Meanwhile, you've been taught your entire life that debt is the enemy. Pay it off. Avoid it. Sleep better without it. So what's going on here? Either every wealthy person on earth is financially illiterate, or there's something about debt that nobody bothered explaining to the rest of us. Here's the uncomfortable answer. The same tool that keeps broke people broke is the exact tool that keeps rich people getting richer. It's not a different tool. It's the same one. The only difference is who's using it and how. And once you understand the mechanics behind this, you're going to look at every loan, every mortgage, and every credit card completely differently. My name is Peak, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, financial psychology, and why some people seem to build wealth like it's easy while everyone else is stuck treading water. If this is the kind of thing that makes your brain itch in a good way, hit subscribe and drop a like if you want more of these breakdowns. Let's start by killing the myth. The advice you've heard your whole life, debt bad, cash good, isn't wrong exactly. It's incomplete. It's the financial equivalent of telling someone fire bad without mentioning that fire also cooks your food and heats your house. Debt isn't inherently destructive. It's neutral. It's a force multiplier. And like any force multiplier, it amplifies whatever you point it at. Point it at a liability, something that loses value or produces nothing, and it multiplies your losses. Point it at an asset, something that appreciates or generates income, and it multiplies your gains. Same tool, opposite outcomes. This one distinction is the entire secret, and almost nobody explains it this clearly. Think about it like a lever. Archimedes supposedly said, give him a lever long enough and a place to stand, and he could move the world. Debt is that lever. If you use it to move a boulder that's crushing you, that's a disaster. If you use it to move a boulder that pays you rent every month, that's a business. The lever doesn't care which one you choose. It just multiplies force. Most people only ever get shown the crushing boulder. Nobody hands you the version where the boulder pays you. So let's talk about how rich people actually use this lever, because once you see the pattern, you'll start noticing it everywhere. The first concept you need is leverage, and I promise this is simpler than it sounds. Leverage just means using borrowed money to control an asset that's bigger than the cash you actually put in. Let's say you buy a rental property worth $500,000. Instead of paying cash, you put down $100,000 and borrow the other $400,000 from a bank. Now here's the part that changes everything. If that property appreciates 5% in a year, that's a $25,000 gain. But you only put in $100,000 of your own money. So your actual return isn't 5%, it's 25%. You just use the bank's money to multiply your return by 5 times. The bank doesn't get a cut of that appreciation. They just get their fixed interest payment. Every dollar of upside above that belongs entirely to you. This is the exact math that built most real estate fortunes in this country. It's not that rich people are smarter at picking properties. It's that they understood early on that borrowing against an appreciating asset turns a modest gain into a massive one, while the downside risk stays capped at what they'd lose either way. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, because leverage isn't just about real estate. It works with stocks, businesses, and something most people have never even heard of, called a securities-based line of credit. Here's how the ultra-wealthy actually live without ever cashing out. Let's say someone has $10 million in stock. If they sell shares to fund their lifestyle, they trigger capital gains taxes, sometimes 20% or more, and they shrink their portfolio permanently. So instead, they walk into a bank and borrow against the stock as collateral. Banks will typically lend up to 50% or so of the portfolio's value at interest rates that are often lower than a mortgage. That person can pull out $1 million in cash, buy a house, fund a business, whatever they want, and they never sold a single share. No capital gains tax triggered. The stock keeps compounding in the background like nothing happened. Meanwhile, they're paying maybe 4 to 6% interest on the loan while their portfolio, historically, grows faster than that over time. They're essentially living on the market's return without ever stepping off the ride. There's actually a name for this strategy in wealth management circles. It's called buy, borrow, die. You buy appreciating assets. You borrow against them tax-free instead of selling. And when you die, in most cases, those assets pass to your heirs with what's called a step-up in cost basis, which can wipe out the unrealized capital gains entirely. The debt gets paid off from the estate. The heirs inherit the rest, and the government never collects the tax bill that a regular person would have paid the moment they sold anything. This single strategy is responsible for a staggering amount of preserved wealth in this country, and most people have never even heard the phrase. Here's a question worth sitting with for a sec. Why don't banks explain any of this to regular customers? It's not some grand conspiracy with a guy in a smoke-filled room. It's simpler and honestly a little more annoying than that. Banks make money differently depending on who's sitting across the desk. For the average customer, the bank's business model is volume. Sell as many credit cards, auto loans, and personal loans as possible at the highest rate the market will bear, and let compounding interest do the work. Nobody in that branch is incentivized to teach you about securities-based lines of credit, because you probably don't have a portfolio big enough to qualify. And even if you did, that's not the department you walked into. The private wealth side of the same bank, upstairs, different floor, different suits, operates on an entirely different model, built around retaining large asset relationships instead of squeezing interest out of small ones. Same institution. Two completely different playbooks, depending on which door you walked through. But let's bring this down from billionaire territory for a second, because this same principle, just borrowed money against appreciating assets, shows up at every level of wealth, including yours, whether you've noticed it or not. Business owners use debt constantly, and not because they're desperate for cash. A business loan to buy equipment that lets you produce twice the output isn't a burden. It's an investment that pays for itself and then keeps paying. If a $50,000 loan lets a small business generate an extra $30,000 a year in profit, that loan isn't debt in the way we normally think about debt. It's a machine that prints money faster than it costs to run. The interest is a rounding error compared to what the leverage produces. This is why you'll hear entrepreneurs say things that sound insane to someone who's never run a business, like "I want more debt," or "good debt is a tool, not a threat." They're not reckless. They've just done the math, and the math works in their favor. Here's another angle that almost nobody talks about, and it's honestly one of the most underrated pieces of this entire puzzle. Inflation. When you borrow money at a fixed interest rate, and inflation rises over time, you are quietly paying that loan back with dollars that are worth less than the dollars you originally borrowed. Let's say you take out a 30-year mortgage at a fixed rate. Your payment stays the same every single month for 3 decades. But your income, in a normal economy, tends to rise with inflation. So the same fixed payment that felt significant in year 1 starts to feel almost trivial by year 20. You are, in a very real sense, borrowing today's expensive dollars and repaying with tomorrow's cheaper ones. Rich people didn't invent this, it's just math. But they're the ones who consistently take advantage of it, because they understand fixed rate debt on an appreciating asset is one of the closest things to a guaranteed win the financial system offers. Then there's the tax piece, which honestly might be the most hidden part of all this. In a lot of cases, interest on debt used to acquire income-producing assets is tax deductible. Business loan interest, mortgage interest on rental property, margin interest used for investing, these can often reduce taxable income. So not only is the debt working for you by multiplying your returns, the government is sometimes subsidizing the cost of that debt through the tax code. This is the part that makes people upset when they find out, and I get it. It feels like a system built for people who already have money. And honestly, there's some truth to that. This strategy requires collateral, which requires assets, which requires some level of starting capital. The bank isn't handing this deal to someone with 0 assets and a maxed out credit card. That's the uncomfortable part of the story. But here's what I want you to really sit with, because this is where it gets practical instead of just theoretical. The mechanism itself isn't reserved for millionaires. It's reserved for anyone who understands it and applies it at their own scale. You don't need $10 million in stock to use leverage intelligently. You need to shift how you evaluate debt in the first place. Here's the filter rich people run every single loan through, whether they say it out loud or not. Does this debt buy something that produces income or appreciates in value? Or does it buy something that immediately loses value the moment I own it? A mortgage on a home in a growing area, a loan for equipment that generates revenue, a reasonable loan for education that meaningfully increases your earning power. These pass the test. A car loan on a vehicle that depreciates 20% the moment you drive it off the lot. A credit card balance carried to fund a lifestyle you can't otherwise afford. A loan for a vacation. These fail the test immediately. Same category, debt. Completely different outcome, because one multiplies wealth and the other multiplies loss. This is genuinely the entire difference. It's not that wealthy people are debt-free. Many of them are more leveraged than the average person. It's that their debt is working a job. It's out there every single day generating income, appreciating, or reducing their tax bill. Meanwhile, the average person's debt is usually just sitting there, quietly draining money every month with nothing coming back. I want to give you a number that puts this in perspective. If you carry $8,000 on a credit card at a typical rate north of 20%, you're paying over $1,600 a year just in interest for absolutely nothing in return. That money doesn't come back to you in any form. It just evaporates. Now compare that to someone with a $400,000 mortgage at 6% on a property that's appreciating and generating rental income. Their interest costs might be higher in raw dollars, but it's attached to an asset that's simultaneously paying them back through appreciation, equity, and cash flow. And in many cases, some of that interest is deductible. Same word, debt, on paper. Completely different financial reality underneath it. There's also a version of this that regular homeowners already have access to and mostly ignore, called a HELOC, a home equity line of credit. If your home has appreciated and you've built up equity, you can often borrow against that equity at a relatively reasonable rate. Used badly, that's a way to fund a vacation and end up worse off than when you started. Used deliberately, it's a way to fund a down payment on a second property or cover a business investment using equity that was otherwise just sitting there, doing nothing, locked inside your walls. The tool is sitting in most homeowners' hands right now. Almost nobody uses it the way wealthy people do, because almost nobody was ever taught to ask what the money would actually be doing once it's out. So how do you actually start applying this without needing millions of dollars sitting around? First, before you take on any debt, ask the one question: what is this debt attached to? If the honest answer is nothing, it just funds my lifestyle. That's a red flag regardless of the interest rate. Second, understand that not all debt needs to be aggressively paid off early. This one sounds like heresy, but a low fixed rate mortgage on an appreciating property is often not something you should rush to eliminate, especially if your money could earn more sitting in investments than you'd save by paying down a cheap loan early. Third, if you ever reach a point where you own appreciating assets, understand that selling isn't always the only way to access their value. Borrowing against them, carefully and conservatively, is a legitimate strategy used at every level of wealth, not just the top. And look, I want to be honest with you about the trade-off here, because this isn't magic and it isn't risk-free. Leverage cuts both ways. If that $500,000 property drops 10% instead of rising, your $100,000 down payment just took a $50,000 hit, a 50% loss, because the leverage that multiplied your gains multiplies your losses just as brutally in reverse. This is exactly what happened to people who over-leveraged themselves right before 2008. The tool didn't change. Their risk tolerance and their timing did. Margin loans against stock portfolios carry a similar danger, sometimes worse, because if your portfolio drops far enough, the lender can issue a margin call and force you to sell at the worst possible moment, turning a paper loss into a permanent one. So this isn't a green light to go borrow as much as possible against everything you own. It's an invitation to understand the mechanism so you can use it deliberately instead of avoiding it out of fear or falling into it out of ignorance. Here's the real takeaway. Rich people don't fear debt because they've trained themselves to ask a different question than everyone else. Instead of how do I get rid of this, they ask, what is this doing for me? That single shift in framing is worth more than almost any specific investment tip you'll ever hear, because it changes how you evaluate every financial decision for the rest of your life. So the next time you see someone financing a purchase they could clearly afford in cash, don't assume they're being reckless. There's a real chance they understand something you haven't been taught yet, that the goal was never to avoid debt entirely. The goal was to make sure the debt was working for them, instead of the other way around. And now, so do you.